Okay. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm live. I want to welcome everybody here for our speaker, who is Joy Buchanan. Our speaker series is sponsored by the Koch Foundation with their generous support, also by Delta Mu Delta Honor Society, the IU East Center for Economic Education, and the IU East Burke Business and Economic Research Center. Our speaker, Joy Buchanan, with me today, is an assistant professor of quantitative analysis and economics at Samford University in Alabama. I have a connection with them because I have several students who went to Samford Law School after graduating. She received her PhD from George Mason University, also Professor Bose. I just wish I had gone there. She has published articles in peer-reviewed journals, including Labor Economics and Experimental Economics. Her research is on behavioral economics with a current focus on applying experimental methods to current issues in the labor market. She got her undergraduate degree in economics at Chapman University, where she was taught by Nobel Prize winner Vernon L. Smith, who founded or co-founded the field of experimental economics, which must have been extremely exciting.
It was very exciting.
So without further ado, here is Joy.
Thank you for that introduction. Thank you for having me. My name is Joy Buchanan, and I'm from Samford, as they said. And this talk is called If Wages Fell During a Recession. So, I know some of you are here with a macroeconomics class. We will be talking about macro issues, and also we'll be talking about behavioral economics and studies with very small groups of people, or people making individual decisions. So you might wonder what the connection is between behavioral economics and macroeconomics, and why I'm presenting two papers that I use lab experiments to generate the data from. But you know, the macroeconomy is individuals making decisions, and all those individual decisions sort of sum up to what goes on at the macro level. So I think that you'll find this to be informative for understanding the broader economy and sort of the decisions that make up big statistics like the unemployment rate and stock market movements and that kind of thing. So the first study is about wage cuts, and as you can imagine, if you've ever had a job, workers do not like seeing their pay go down. You probably have never experienced that, because it very rarely happens in the American economy that someone shows up and they actually get less money than they did the day before for the same job. And then the second experiment is kind of inspired by that fact, and it's just about more reference dependence in general in a behavioral study, which will link back to the macroeconomy again at the end. All right, I'd like to ask a question. Does anyone in the room know what the current unemployment rate is in the United States? Or if you want to guess.
You want a ballpark?
Ballpark, what do you think?
4.3.
4.3? Anyone think it's lower than that? It's actually lower than that. So in December last year it was 3.5%, and it hasn't gone up much since then. So is that high or low? Is that considered a low unemployment rate or high? Very low. It's very low. It's low. So we are in a tight labor market right now. We're currently experiencing low unemployment in the U.S. So that kind of sets the stage for where we're at right now. And I'll be talking about why unemployment happens, and especially why we tend to have higher unemployment after a recession. To back up a little bit, unemployment is people who want to form a labor contract but cannot find a job at sort of current market conditions. And so one way to think about this is that the wages that are being offered for jobs right now are maybe higher than they need to be, because you have people who want those jobs, sort of excess supply of workers, and instead of the wages just falling to sort of make that market sort of match, you have a few jobs that are paying a lot, and you have sort of too many people trying to get those jobs. So one reason for that is we say that labor contracts are incomplete. What I mean by incomplete is that not every single thing that you want your worker to do can be specified in a contract. So, you hire somebody, they're going to perform some kind of service in the future, and it's very difficult to actually spell out every single thing that they're going to do on paper. What you really want is you want someone who's going to show up, be motivated, take initiative, and just sort of do the right thing, be responsive to customers, even if the manager's not looking over their shoulder every second. So labor contracts are typically incomplete in the sense that there's some things you want them to do that you haven't necessarily spelled out completely, and that you can't necessarily monitor at all times. That's what we mean by incomplete. So what could that have to do with unemployment? I started by asking you the unemployment rate. If labor contracts are incomplete, then what we tend to see, or at least what we think is happening, is workers actually get paid a little bit more than they need to be paid to take the job. So that the people who do match into jobs are more motivated, morale is better, and they're just going to be sort of better workers even when they're not being watched, because they understand they're receiving this sort of efficiency wage. Now what does that have to do with unemployment? If wages are above sort of the equilibrium level, then that means that you're going to hire less people, because the cost of hiring people has gone up, so the demand for hiring people has gone down, and you've got people who want the jobs who can't match into them, because wages are a little higher than they really need to be to get people to just take the job. So that leads to the experiment that I'm going to run people through, and the basic setup is what we call the gift exchange game. So high wages are considered a gift because it's sort of more than you need to give the worker for them to just sort of match with you. And then effort that's above the minimum level, that's maybe reciprocated back from the worker, is also considered a gift. So that's why it's called gift exchange. So the employer sort of gifts a high wage to the worker, and then if they want to, if they sort of feel like it, the worker might gift back an above minimum effort level. So the worker might not sort of shirk because they understand that they've been gifted this higher wage. So you could have this situation where everyone's sort of cooperating and helping each other out because they want to. They just sort of feel like it's the appropriate thing to do. So here's how the game works. In the first stage, the employer sets a wage level. And then if a worker matches with them, they kind of make an agreement. And the agreement is that the wage will get paid no matter what. So now the worker has sort of locked in this wage. And then in stage 2, the worker sets an effort level. And the sequence is important because the wage has already been determined. So if the worker shirks in stage 2, there's no way to punish them. If they work hard, if they work above that minimum effort level, it's because they want to, or they feel some sort of responsibility to reciprocate that sort of nice action back to the employer. So the payoff for the employer in this setup is some constant minus the wage they pay times the effort level of the employee. So the profit for the employer is higher if the worker works harder, and it's lower if they have to pay a high wage. So they sort of don't want to pay a high wage, but they do want the worker to work, and that's sort of the conflict there. And so from the worker's point of view, they get this wage no matter what. Effort is costly. So I'm not so much asking you what you think the worker would do, but let me ask you, this is just an objective question. How does the worker maximize their just monetary payoff here? What choice of effort level should they make just to get the most money out of the game? So they get the wage no matter what, and effort is costly. So should they work hard or not? No, right. So just to get the most money out of the game, they should take that wage and just shirk and not work. But I saw some hesitation. I saw some of you feel like, oh, that doesn't sound right. So a lot of them might feel like they should work hard and they shouldn't just sort of run off with that wage that they were gifted. They might feel like they ought to give back a high effort level, and we can see in the laboratory what people actually do. So there's one prediction for just sort of pure sort of payoff maximization, that workers will minimize their own costs by shirking. And if employers sort of look ahead and believe that that's what's going to happen, then they're not going to gift them high wages. They're just going to give them the lowest wage that they can. And this is sort of stable but bad because no one's going to make much money. There's sort of no surplus being generated here. No work is getting done. There's also an alternative theory called the fair wage effort theory. And that would mean that what you pay someone actually affects the quality of work you get from them. So it's not the same as just like buying a box off of a shelf. The more you pay for the worker, the better product you get because they're more motivated and they'll sort of do their best even if they're not being watched, that kind of thing. So the hypothesis here is that effort level is increasing in wage. And what that would mean, so we're going to get back to macro stuff. What that would mean is that average wages are higher than the market clearing price of labor. And average effort is above the minimum level because wages are high, so the worker is gifting back that higher effort level. They're not sort of shirking or retaliating when no one's looking. And then how does that loop back to the unemployment rate I asked you about earlier? If wages are higher than they need to be to get people to take the jobs, then lots of people want these jobs, but the employer can't afford to hire everyone who wants the job, so then we have involuntary unemployment. So that's sort of how it all fits together. And when this initial game was run in a laboratory setting with human subjects, the results tended to favor that fair wage effort theory. So we could have observed that people were in the bad equilibrium where they didn't gift the high wage and they didn't, gift the high effort and no one made very much money. But what we actually tended to observe is that employers would give sort of more than they needed to, and that workers would reciprocate that by not shirking, and they would actually generate some surplus in the experiment. So that was done sort of back in the 90s, and that's a setup that we're going to use to test a new idea out. So, something to take away from this is that the way people feel about their wages matter. So this is maybe a tie-in to behavioral economics here. And especially because in real jobs, it's often true that contracts are incomplete. And it's often true that it's costly to monitor people all the time. So you just sort of want them to have high morale, be motivated, and sort of do the right thing because they care about their employer and they're trying to do a good job. And so, like I said, this has implications for the entire labor market equilibrium and could be an explanation for some percent of the unemployment that we observe at the macro level. Now, if we throw in recessions now. During a recession, demand falls. Wages could fall because the demand for everything has fallen. The demand for sort of the output of the worker has fallen. So you might think it would be appropriate for wages to fall during a recession. But remember we said that feelings matter, and the way people feel about their wage matters, and we don't want the workers to be upset. So maybe wages don't fall during a recession. That would be called wage rigidity. Has that been talked about in class? Yes, it has. And so not only do we have sort of this general state of like maybe there's always a little bit of an efficiency wage going on and wages are like a little too high all the time anyway, but then after a recession, wages really ought to fall and they don't because of a sort of resistance to lowering the wage. And that leads to yet more unemployment because we're in that situation where wages for jobs are high, everybody wants to match into those good jobs with the high wages, but since wages are not in equilibrium, there are more people trying to get those jobs than there are employers who can hire at that job, and we sort of have this gap. And for the people who are not matched, for the people who are unemployed, this can be really painful. This is bad for American families who feel sort of locked out of the good contracts. So this is what we're trying to understand by the experiment that I'm going to describe. Here is some more just sort of locating ourselves in the current macro conditions. So this is almost back 20 years. This is the unemployment rate that's tracked by the Bureau of Labor Statistics for the United States. And what kind of stands out here? What are sort of the big events? What do you think? Yes, so you're talking about this one. So this is COVID for sure. So we were at a pretty low level of unemployment, and then suddenly the COVID pandemic came to the United States. A lot of people had to go home, hotels had to close for months, and so a lot of people lost their job, but then it recovered super fast. This is a very unusual thing to see in unemployment data, for things to change so fast and then revert so fast, and we pretty quickly returned to low employment. And what's the other big event that you can see here? Yeah.
You might say?
What? I was going to say the recession.
Yeah, so this is the Great Recession, and notice how different they are. So the Great Recession hits, fairly unexpected, and you see this fairly rapid rise in unemployment, all the way up to about 10%. That's very high for the United States. And then it doesn't just drop down again, right? It just kind of like hangs out near 10% for years. And just kind of drags on, and you have people now experiencing, years of unemployment instead of just months of unemployment. This is bad. And people came up with a name for this. They called it the jobless recovery, because a recession is generally defined as a quarter where GDP declines. And so GDP declined, but then GDP recovered pretty quickly in the Great Recession. But unemployment was very slow to return to the pre-recession level. So we had the jobless recovery. We're trying to understand why that happened. You had lots of people seeking work who couldn't match into the labor market, and we want to better understand sort of what's going on and the individual decisions that led up to that. Here's some more data. This actually goes back even further. And what you see in the gray bars here are recessions that have hit the US economy in the past few decades. So the Great Recession is here, and it only goes up to 2012. And so what we're observing here is how wages were evolving all through these years. So wages are going up. What this actually shows is wage growth. And its nominal wage growth is always positive. So that means that everyone's getting nominal, at least, raises every single year. And so look what's happening in the Great Recession and the jobless recovery. You might have thought if we'd had 10% unemployment for a year, that wages would start going down to kind of re-equilibrate that market. But actually we're seeing that nominal wage growth continued throughout all of that, which is interesting. We're not seeing people getting wage cuts, even though there are lots of people who would have liked to take their jobs. And so you said that you've heard of wage rigidity. This is possible evidence for downward wage rigidity. When there is some pressure in economic conditions for nominal wages to fall, at least in the US economy, they rarely do. It's very unusual for people to take actual wage cuts. It's more likely that an employer will lay off 10% of their workforce than give everybody a 10% wage cut. And I mean, it's hard to know exactly why that is, but one possible reason for that is the bad morale issue. Is the managers feel like if they did that, then they'd face a full house of unhappy people, and they'd rather have 90% of their workforce that's happy, and so that's something that we can test in a lab. So I think I explained this already, but the wage rigidity is linked to unemployment, because if wages are higher than they need to be to get people to take jobs, then we sort of have excess workers who can't match into the labor market. And then if we think about what happens in recession, then wages sort of should fall, but they don't, and so that gets exacerbated, and that could be a cause of the jobless recovery. Here's some more sort of real-world, outside the lab data on possible evidence for downward wage rigidity. This is like wage changes for about the time period that you saw in the last graph, going back to the 80s. And you see a big spike at 0. There are lots of people who just get the same wage from round to round. And then you see sort of a mass of small raises. So it's very common for someone to get a 1 or 2% raise at the end of the year, and some people sort of expect that to happen every year. But it's very uncommon to see an actual wage cut which again, it's possible evidence for this resistance on the part of employers to cutting wages, even if we are in a period of low demand, like we were in the Great Recession. Okay, so that was proposed as a potential reason for the jobless recovery, and that leads to the paper that I want to talk to you about. We used a gift exchange game environment, so that's why I explained that in the beginning, and we created a recession on purpose to sort of create a place where, according to one theory, wages should fall. And if they don't fall, then maybe that is evidence for some kind of behavioral phenomenon, some kind of resistance to cutting wages. And we make a kind of very simple environment, so we don't have any menu costs. There's kind of no reason for the wages to not fall, aside from maybe this more behavioral story. And it also, if it does happen that wages fall, then we get a chance to observe what would happen if wages fall. That's where the title of the paper comes from, because we have so few chances to observe that in the American economy. But if we see it happen in the lab, then we can see how workers react to that. So here's the setup. People come into our lab experiment and they are paired. So there's two people in a group. One is the employer and one is the worker. And they're paired for 7 rounds. And they play the gift exchange game repeatedly 7 times. So there is a recession intentionally introduced between round 4 and round 5. So first they play 1 round. And then if they want to, the employer can adjust their wage between round 1 and round 2. And then that wage is going to be the same for round 2 and round 3 and round 4. So the worker kind of gets used to seeing the same nominal number 3 times in a row. And the worker has 3 chances to set an effort level. And it's what I described before, where the worker can shirk, but they can also choose to pay a small cost in order to reciprocate some effort that helps the employer out. And then everyone's given the same information between rounds 4 and 5. They learn that something bad has happened, and now there's sort of less surplus to go around. And then the employer, if they want to, they don't have to, can change the wage for the last 3 rounds of the experiment. So we could observe wage rigidity, where they just don't change the wage, but we would also give them a chance to sort of cut the wage if they want to. And so let me remind you of how the employer makes money. The employer makes money if the worker works. They pay the cost of the wage, that's why there's a negative sign in front of the W. And then there's kind of this fixed constant that determines sort of how much there is to split up. And so in the recession treatment, we make R go down. So if the wage is constant, if they don't cut wages, then the employer will be worse off. They'll make less money. And so they might feel like it's fair to kind of pass that bad event on to the worker, or at least sort of share that with the worker. But we'll see what happens. We'll see if they choose to do that, and we'll see if workers feel like that's fair. There's a second treatment, totally the same except for one thing. The way the recession happens in the inflation treatment is that we actually alter the exchange rate of experimental tokens to dollars. So there's a 10% recession here. There's also a 10% recession here. But here's the thing about the inflation treatment. If the employer simply keeps their nominal wage the same, in the inflation treatment, they'll actually experience a real wage cut, but they won't necessarily see it, which happens to us. I don't know how many of you are working right now, but we had really high inflation in the past year, and if you just didn't get a big raise, you got a real wage cut. I got a real wage cut this past year for sure. Unless you got a significant raise, you actually accepted a real wage cut because of the high inflation that's going on in the economy right now. And so that's what was happening in this version of the experiment here. But otherwise, they were exactly the same. Same instructions leading in, same gift exchange game, etc. Okay. So let's talk about what was happening before the bad news. So in round 4, this is what was happening. We had some pairs that were at kind of what I described as the bad equilibrium before. So the employer had offered a low wage, and the worker wasn't very happy and was shirking. And so no one was making very much money. That can happen, and it in fact did happen for some of the groups. Other groups of two, they're not seeing what the other groups are doing. So every group is sort of, by themselves. Other groups of two were cooperating. So this group of people, the wage offer was sort of at the mid-level, and it was reciprocated with kind of a mid-level of effort, and those groups were making more money. So they sort of had a good thing going, and there was something that could potentially be ruined by the recession. And then there was another group of people who even were sort of doing better, but I don't have many observations in that group. So for statistical reasons, I'm going to talk about this group for a second. So they were sort of cooperating, they had a good thing going, and then we sort of hit them with this recession news, and we look to see what's going to happen. We could observe wage rigidity, and what that would look like is if the employer doesn't cut wages, and maybe because they're afraid of low morale, which is what actual managers report in the economy. So, before I show you what happened, I'm just going to ask you to think about it. If they experienced a wage cut in the recession treatment, which by some theory could be justified because there was sort of bad news, do you think that workers just kept working, or do you think they retaliated by shirking? What do you think?
Hey, sure.
They shirked. They got mad. Okay, well, we'll see, right? Okay, so here's what we see. This is the recession treatment. So the dark bar is the people who did not experience a wage cut. So they get the recession news. They're in the end of the experiment. This is the end. So there's no way for them to be punished if they did shirk. There's no chance to change their wage again. But they seem happy, they seem content, and they continue to work about as hard as they did before. But then, if you look at the group that did experience a nominal wage cut, as you predicted, they got mad. And some of them just actually dropped all the way down to the bottom. It made them angry, and they decided to retaliate by shirking. So it's interesting, they had experienced the same wage for 3 rounds in a row, and it does seem to have formed some kind of a reference point. They kind of got used to it, it was their wage, they'd had it for 3 times in a row, and then having to experience a loss from that reference point seemed to make them upset. So there's definitely a significant difference between the people who did get a wage cut and the people who didn't. If you try to imagine what would happen if your boss told you that you were going to suddenly start making less money for the same job, that might make you upset too. If we look at what happened in the inflation treatment, we see the same thing. Now keep in mind, if they get a nominal wage cut in the inflation treatment, then that's actually an even bigger real wage cut. But I'm just going to emphasize that it kind of seems like the same thing is happening. They do sort of retaliate against nominal wage cuts, and I can also show in the paper that they do seem more sensitive to nominal wage cuts than they are to real wage cuts. So I showed you this, so you know that when wages are cut, it does seem like workers retaliate. But I didn't tell you how often it happened. Do you think that a lot of employers cut wages, or just a few people?
Do you want a naive guess?
Sure, naive guess.
Naive employers cut wages.
Okay, naive employers cut wages. That is correct. So these are college students. They're not experienced in human resources or management, and over half, so over 50% of the employers, they get the bad news and they decide to sort of share that bad event with their worker, and they cut nominal wages. And so we rarely see that in the real economy. So we did not observe wage rigidity, as I described it to you earlier. These are naive, that's a great word to use to describe them, and they did cut wages, and the workers really punished them for doing that. And if you also look in terms of real wages in inflation, it's almost the same amount. It's still sort of more than half of people do this. So we also did something, and this is what's fun about lab experiments, is that you can ask people questions, and you can do things that are hard to do in the outside world. So we did something called an incentivized belief elicitation. So before I told them how their worker had responded to the new wage in round 5, I asked them to make predictions about what other people had done. and they were paid for being correct. So I'm trying to kind of get at what they really think, not just tell me what they think I want to hear. So part of their payment for the experiment depends on the beliefs they state. And I asked them, what do you think a worker would do in this scenario? And I find that they're actually not very good in anticipating that effort will fall in response to wage cuts. So it's like they cut wages, and that kind of matches the beliefs that they indicate in the survey, where they don't seem to get it. They don't seem to understand that if someone experiences a wage cut, they're going to sort of retaliate in a sense. So the beliefs seem to sort of line up with the behavior. The beliefs are wrong, but they do seem to explain the behavior that we saw with all the wage cuts. Okay, so I'm finding that, what time? How are we doing with time?
We got another 30 minutes.
Okay, great. So I'm finding that the employers, like I said, they don't seem to get it. They don't really seem to do a good job of appreciating the fact that the workers have formed a reference point and that they're going to make decisions sort of based off of that reference point. Again, it's just a short experiment. They only experienced that nominal wage 3 times, but it did seem to matter to them. And so, I thought it was interesting that the beliefs were wrong. And notice that they lose money. So I don't know if I guess I didn't necessarily say this yet, but the employers who cut nominal wages between rounds 4 and 5 made less money, because the way the payoffs are set up, if your worker doesn't work, you're not going to make very much money in the experiment. So maybe they sort of saved money by cutting wages, but it ended up being bad, because then they weren't sort of making any surplus, because that whole term is multiplied by effort. So it really, like, the fact that they were wrong cost them money. And so I just found this itself to be interesting. And that kind of leads to questions about, like, whether we're generally good at thinking about the reference points that other people have. So we don't like losses. It really hurts if you sort of have something and it gets taken away from you. So we as humans tend to exhibit reference-dependent behavior. There's lots of evidence of this and sort of replications of this. And it's just pretty sort of fundamental, and you can kind of think through it for your own life. Or if I asked you to imagine how you would feel if you got a wage cut in your current job, you can imagine that would annoy you. I don't know if you'd quit or not, but it would at least be annoying, right? So we sort of can see this behavior in ourselves, but are we good at thinking about other people's reference points and using that to try to anticipate what they're going to do? So that leads to this next paper I'll talk about. It's called My Reference Point, Not Yours. And so we're sort of going from behavioral and macroeconomics back and forth here. So it kind of started with this question of, are the employers and employees kind of talking past each other? And then I just kind of wanted to ask this more general question of, are we just all talking past each other in general? So I made a more sort of general, simple environment where if you can anticipate that other people have different reference points than you, then you can make more money because you'll have correct beliefs. Okay, so this is even simpler. I can go through the design really fast. It's a really simple experiment. People came in to do this, and it took them less than 30 minutes to just do the whole thing. So, first they make a choice, and they could earn up to $12 for that choice. They get to keep that no matter what. And then they make predictions, and they can earn up to $12 in the predictions. So, if they make good choices and get kind of lucky, and if they make good predictions, then they could make like maybe over $20 in half an hour. So hopefully this is a fairly salient decision for them. And it's sort of this question of whether you can put yourself in someone else's shoes, not just to be nice, because sometimes we talk about doing that to be nice, like, oh, you should empathize with people, or you should try to like think things through from their perspective. But what if you're getting paid to do it? Can you do it even if you're getting paid? Or is it just kind of hard to do? So here is that choice that I said, the first choice. You're assigned an endowment randomly. If you think about rolling a 6-sided die, you're going to come up with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. So you're assigned an endowment randomly. So you could get $1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 initially. Then you have a choice. One option, just keep it. You got $5, just keep the $5. You got $6, just keep the $6 and move on to the next stage. Other option. I call it option B. That's going to be a gamble. You have a 50% chance of doubling your money. So if you got $6 and you double it, how much do you get? 12. It's pretty good. But you also have a 50% chance of getting $1. So if you started with $6, you have a 50% chance of going down. And people hate going down, don't they? So you have to anticipate, would I be super upset if I got the $1? And maybe I would rather just avoid the whole thing and just keep so that I don't have to go, down from my reference point. But imagine the person who started with $1. Would they keep or gamble? They should gamble. Why?
Because they have higher chance to get more than $1.
Yeah, they have nothing to lose, in a sense. They could go up, and this is not a loss for them. So for every person, the alternative is $1, no matter what your endowment was, okay? They actually make more than one choice, but I'm just going to focus on choice number 1. That's the most interesting one. And so what happens is people come in, they get the instructions, pretty simple instructions. That endowment is assigned, so it could be $1, it could be $6. Then they make their choice, and then they make predictions about other people. So this is how the predictions work. I ask them to think about what everybody did. And I say recall that all other participants saw the same instructions that you saw and experienced random die rolls. So I'm trying to remind them that in the beginning, everyone had an equal chance of getting 1 or 6 or something in the middle. And then I say, guess the percent of all people who decided to keep. So everyone's actually trying to predict the same thing in the prediction stage, okay? So we kind of went through this, but I think it's worth saying it. If a player started with $1, how likely are they to keep? 0. Yeah, they shouldn't keep, they should gamble. If the player started with $6, how likely are they to keep? What do you think?
Will this be a multiple trial?
What?
Will this be a multiple trial?
No. One chance.
Expected value is still $6.50, so they should go ahead and gamble.
So if they're expected value maximizers, they should gamble.
But
Expected
if
value
they're
maximizers.
coffee cup holders,
They're coffee cup holders, that's right.
they're going to keep it.
Okay, well, I'll just show you what happened. So, this is what happened. So, the dark bars are the people who started with the $6 high endowment, and more than half of them keep. They just don't want to go down to $1. They're not expected value maximizers. They are just, they don't want to be disappointed. Down here, you see what happens for the people who started with $1. They do exactly what they should do, which is gamble. Because maybe they still have $1, or maybe they go up to $2. So there's a big difference in the choices that people make, depending on the endowment that they have. And that was expected to happen. The research question is not this. The research question is, can they think about what other people were doing? So, keep in mind, everyone's trying to predict the same thing. I won't ask you to say it out loud, but think what percent of all players keep. Maybe make a guess in your head before I show you the results. And then this is what I find. I find that, again, dark bars are people who started the game with $6. The people who started with the high endowment think most people keep. Even though they know they're given the information that some people have low endowments and some people have high endowments, but they have a hard time processing that information. They have a hard time sort of thinking through just how attractive the gamble would be to someone with a low endowment. And then these light bars are the predictions that were made by people with the low endowment. So if you started with $1, you kind of can't imagine keeping. That would be dumb. It doesn't maximize expected value, as you pointed out. So they think that, you know, less than half of people would gamble. And there's a huge gap here, right? Neither of them are right. The actual answer is closer to the middle. And they're not thinking about the reference points of other people. So this is a pretty sort of pure behavioral study, but the way that it links back to macroeconomics is I was trying to understand the first experiment, where we had people giving these wage cuts that actually lost them money. And if they had been better able to sort of put themselves in the shoes of their employee, then they might never have cut wages and they would have actually made more money as a result. Another way to link this to macroeconomics is, you know, in some cases, being able to predict what other people are going to do can help you make money. So, you know, in a competitive market, we can trade with all kinds of people and we don't even have to know them. And this is really neat. We can do a lot of trade with people who we don't understand very well, who live in other countries, and that's one reason why we're so wealthy today. But there are some cases where it really does help to be able to anticipate what other people are going to do. You know, if you're trying to introduce a new product to the market, or you're trying to play the stock market, something like that. So I'm just going to show you the stock, the S&P 500 price, roughly sort of pre-pandemic to today. Remember the big spike in unemployment? That was also a big drop in the stock market, but another, you know, quick recovery. Now, of course, part of the reason the recovery was so quick was because of absolutely massive stimulus on the part of the federal government. And that does come at a cost, right? That's why we're experiencing really high inflation right now, and that's why most of us took a real wage cut in the past year. But it did definitely help, you know, the price of assets stay up. And so, you know, if you think about it, if you could have better anticipated sort of how people would react to the COVID news, and then, you know, how quickly we would get out of it, then you could have made a lot of money. You know, when I talk about this experiment, I think, you know, we live in such a large, diverse society. It's very normal to sort of misunderstand each other, to kind of assume that other people will make the choices you make, because you're sort of operating out of your own reference points. And it's hard to make that jump and think about the reference points that other people are operating from. And again, sometimes we think of it as sort of altruistic to, you know, walk around in someone else's shoes. I have this quote from Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird, and he says, you know, you sort of should do this. But aside from that, you know, even if there's money on the line, it's sort of hard to do. And so I think this, you know, helps explain why, as you said, naive subjects in the role of managers cut wages because they sort of didn't think through the effects. But if we do surveys with not naive, with experienced managers, they will tell you that they don't cut wages because of the morale issues, and that's sort of their beliefs, which maybe are correct beliefs according to our data, are explaining wage rigidity, which feeds into big indicators like the US unemployment rate. So maybe wage rigidity is coming from those expectations, and maybe those expectations are correct. We did find in the experiment that people don't like nominal wage cuts. And we also found that people are less sensitive to real wage cuts if they're sort of masked by inflation. And maybe that's what's happening today. Like I said, I took a real wage cut this past year. Many of you probably did as well, unless you got a really big raise. The same amount of dollars are buying less now. But psychologically, it's not the same. It doesn't hurt as much as someone actually like lowering that number you see on your paycheck. Part of the reason why that COVID spike was so, quick is because of that government stimulus, but it did come at the cost of high inflation that we're still experiencing today. I showed you what happened in the Great Recession. I showed you the jobless recovery, and I showed you 10% unemployment, almost, that went on for years, and that's not great either. So there's a lot of trade-offs here. Something like the Great Recession could happen again. It may feel like ancient history to college students, but I feel like it's worth understanding, and that's sort of what motivated the initial study. And we do seem to find that Americans today are tolerating real wage cuts pretty well. We do see really low unemployment in this environment. but maybe they wouldn't be so happy if these came in the form of nominal wage cuts. So that's the end. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Oh, come on.
Yeah, I have a question for you. First, the experiment. So you measured the wage cut with the employee's effort. How did you measure employee's effort?
That's a good question. So this is called stated effort. So they just choose an effort level from a list, and every effort level is associated with an explicit cost. So we're not asking them to do some kind of tedious task.